Good evening. Welcome to this third exploration of the ancient biblical world. Tonight, Facts 151 through 200. A journey to the heart of the first century, following Jesus and Paul, the first Christians who changed the world. During these 60 minutes, we will walk in Galilee, Nazareth, Capernaum and Magdala, the villages where Jesus taught, healed and overturned certainties. We will discover Jerusalem in Herod's time, its luxurious baths, its Roman theater and suspended bridges to the temple, a city of grandeur and violence. We will follow Paul on Roman roads, from Corinth to Ephesus, from the Agora to the catacombs. How Christianity spread through the empire. We will examine New Testament manuscripts, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus and the earliest papyri. How the words reached us, and we will confront modern controversies. The Shroud of Turin, the James Ossuary. When archaeology becomes spectacle. 50 facts. From Nazareth to Rome. The complete story. Make yourself comfortable. Breathe deeply. And dive into this first century that still resonates today. Everything is still, everything is peaceful. We begin. Chapter 1. Jesus in Galilee, Forgotten Landscapes and Cities. The Galilee of Jesus. Nazareth. Capernaum. These names resonate in our imagination. But what does archaeology really reveal about these places? Part 151. Nazareth, an insignificant village becomes symbol. Nazareth in the first century. A tiny village. Perhaps 200 inhabitants. No mention in ancient Jewish sources. No strategic or commercial importance. Recent excavations, notably those directed by Yardena Alexander since 2009, have revealed modest dwellings carved into limestone. Caves used as storage. Olive presses. A simple rural life. Why does Jesus come from this obscure place? The Gospels themselves emphasize Nazareth's insignificance. Nathanael asks, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" This humble origin becomes theologically significant. The Messiah does not come from a center of power. He comes from a village no one notices. Nazareth reminds us that God often chooses what is weak, marginal, forgotten. Archaeology confirms, Nazareth was truly insignificant. Part 152. The Nazareth Oil Press and Local Economy. In 2009, archaeologists discovered an olive oil press in Nazareth dating to the 1st century. This press testifies to agricultural activity. Nazareth inhabitants cultivated olive trees, produced oil, probably for their own consumption and perhaps some local trade. Joseph, Jesus' adoptive father, was a carpenter, or more precisely a woodworker. Jesus would have grown up in this rural and artisanal milieu. Olive oil was essential for cooking, lighting, religious rituals. This press plunges us into the concrete daily life of the Holy Family. The oil press reminds us that Jesus lived an ordinary life, in a modest economy, before beginning his ministry. Part 153, Capernaum, Peter's City Rediscovered. Capernaum, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, was Jesus' headquarters in Galilee. There he lived, taught, healed. Franciscan excavations since the 1960s, then more recent work, uncovered a 4th-century synagogue built on foundations of an older 1st-century synagogue, likely where Jesus taught. Beside it, a Byzantine house transformed into a memorial church. Archaeologists think this is Peter's house, venerated from the 1st century as a holy site. Graffiti in Greek, Aramaic, Latin, traced by pilgrims, invoke Jesus and Peter. These inscriptions date to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Capernaum offers rare continuity, a place where Jesus lived, venerated without interruption for 2,000 years. Part 154, the Magdala Synagogue and the Menorah Stone. In 2009, during hotel construction in Magdala on the Sea of Galilee shore, archaeologists discovered a 1st-century synagogue contemporary with Jesus. This discovery was sensational. Few synagogues from this period have survived. This one is remarkably preserved. At the center, a carved stone representing the temple menorah in Jerusalem, along with other ritual symbols. This stone is unique, the oldest known three-dimensional representation of the menorah. The stone was probably carved by someone who had seen the real menorah at the temple before its destruction in 70 CE. Magdala and its stone bring us closer to the religious world in which Jesus moved. Galilean synagogues were alive, active, central. Part 155, Fishing Boats from the Sea of Galilee. In 1986, during a drought that lowered the Sea of Galilee level, 2 brothers discovered in the mud remains of an ancient boat. The boat, dating to the 1st century, measured about 8 meters long. It could carry a dozen people. It was exactly the type of boat used by Galilean fishermen, Peter, Andrew, James, John. The boat was extracted with enormous care, treated to prevent disintegration, and is now displayed at Kibbutz Ginosar. This boat allows us to concretely visualize gospel narratives, Jesus boarding a boat, teaching from the boat, calming the storm. The lake boat reminds us that the Gospels describe real situations, anchored in precise geography and technology. Chapter 2. Jerusalem in Herod's time, Grandeur and Violence. Jerusalem in Jesus' time was Herod's city. A transformed metropolis. Beautified, but also oppressed. Part 156, Herod's Baths discovered near the temple. In 2020, archaeologists discovered near the Temple Mount remains of luxurious baths dating to the Herodian period. These public baths, built in Roman style, included hot, warm and cold rooms. Mosaics decorated the floors. The hypocaust heating system was sophisticated. Herod, client king of Rome, imported Roman lifestyle to Judea. He built theaters, hippodromes, palaces, baths. This Hellenization and Romanization shocked traditionalist Jews. The baths, where one bathed naked, violated Jewish modesty norms. Herod's baths illustrate the cultural tension of the era, between Jewish tradition and Greco-Roman modernity. Part 157, Jerusalem's Roman Theater finally located. For centuries, historians wondered where Herod's theater in Jerusalem was located. Josephus mentions it, but no trace had been found. In 2017, Israeli archaeologists announced identifying remains that could correspond to this theater, in the Armenian quarter of the Old City. The Herodian theater could accommodate several thousand spectators. Greek and Roman plays were presented, entertainment foreign to traditional Jewish culture. This theater's existence shows Herod wanted to make Jerusalem a cosmopolitan city, like great Hellenistic cities. The Roman theater reminds us that Jerusalem in Jesus' time was a city torn between multiple identities. Part 158. Suspended bridges connecting temple to upper city. Herod's temple stood on the Temple Mount, dominating Jerusalem. To connect the temple to the upper city, where elites lived, Herod built suspended bridges. Wilson's Arch, named after the archaeologist who identified it in the 19th century, is one of these bridges. It spanned the Tyropoeon Valley, allowing direct access from the royal palace to the temple. These bridges were engineering feats. They testify to Herod's architectural ambition. During the revolt of 66 to 70 CE, Jewish rebels destroyed these bridges to slow Roman advance. But Romans eventually took the temple and destroyed it. The suspended bridges remind us Herod wanted a monumental Jerusalem. But this grandeur was ephemeral. Part 159. The Pool of Bethesda and its 5 porticos. John's Gospel mentions a pool in Jerusalem, near the Sheep Gate, called Bethesda, which had 5 porticos. There Jesus healed a paralytic. For a long time, this detail of 5 porticos seemed strange. Why 5 and not 4? Excavations of the 19th and 20th centuries revealed that Bethesda was actually a double pool, 2 basins separated by a central wall. Each basin had a portico on its 4 sides, and the 5th portico ran along the central wall. This unusual configuration corresponds exactly to the Johannine description. A precise topographic detail. The Pool of Bethesda shows John's author knew Jerusalem before its destruction. He describes real places with accuracy. Part 160. The Stone of Anointing, Legend and Devotion. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, just at the entrance, is a large red stone slab called the Stone of Anointing. According to tradition, this is where Jesus' body was prepared for burial. This current stone dates to the 19th century, but replaces older stones venerated for centuries at the same spot. No archaeological proof confirms this is the exact place where Jesus was anointed. The tradition rests on collective memory and devotion. Millions of pilgrims come to touch this stone, kiss it, place objects on it to bless. Devotion transforms the stone into sacred object. The Stone of Anointing reminds us that some holy sites rest more on faith and tradition than archaeological certainty. Chapter 3. Paul, Travels and the Spread of Christianity. After Jesus, Paul, the apostle to the nations, traveling constantly, founding communities, writing letters. Part 161. Roman roads traveled by Paul. Paul traveled thousands of miles across the Roman Empire. He mainly traveled on Roman roads, those paved ways connecting all provinces to Rome. The Via Egnatia, for example, crossed Macedonia and Thrace. Paul took it during his second missionary journey, visiting Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. These roads were remarkable, paved with stones, equipped with milestones indicating distances, punctuated with rest stations where travelers could stop. Thanks to these roads, Paul could travel relatively quickly and safely, at least relatively safely, as he was several times attacked, imprisoned, flogged. Roman roads remind us that Christianity's spread was facilitated by imperial infrastructure. Rome, unknowingly, prepared the gospel's ways. Part 162. Corinth, excavations of the agora where Paul preached. Corinth, a great port city of Greece, was one of Paul's ministry's important centers. He lived there 18 months, founded a community, wrote letters. Archaeological excavations in Corinth uncovered the agora, the public square where Paul preached. One can still see the bema, that platform where Paul appeared before Proconsul Gallio. The Acts of the Apostles recounts that Corinth's Jews dragged Paul before Gallio, accusing him of persuading people to worship God contrary to law. Gallio refused to judge this matter, considering it an internal religious dispute. An inscription mentioning Gallio, discovered at Delphi, allows precise dating of Paul's presence in Corinth, around 51 to 52 CE. Corinth and its agora take us back to the heart of Paul's missionary action. The places he walked are still there. Part 163. Ephesus, the theater of the silversmiths' riot. Ephesus, in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, was one of the Roman Empire's largest cities. Paul spent 3 years there, teaching, debating, performing miracles. Acts recounts a spectacular riot. Ephesus's silversmiths, who made Artemis statuettes, feared Paul's preaching would harm their commerce. They stirred up the crowd, shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The crowd gathered in Ephesus's theater, an immense amphitheater holding 25,000 spectators. This theater still exists, magnificently preserved. To stand in this theater today is to imagine the scene, the furious crowd, Paul wanting to address them, his disciples holding him back. Ephesus's theater reminds us that early Christian preaching provoked violent reactions. Paul's message disturbed the established order. Part 164. The Nag Hammadi Papyri and Gnostic Christianity. In 1945, in Egypt, near the city of Nag Hammadi, a peasant discovered a jar containing 13 papyrus codices. These manuscripts, dating to the 4th century, contained Gnostic texts, writings representing an alternative form of Christianity, emphasizing secret knowledge, gnosis. Among these texts, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth. Non-canonical Gospels, rejected by the early Church as heretical. These texts show early Christianity was more diverse than often thought. Different communities had different theologies, different sacred texts. The Nag Hammadi Papyri remind us that the Christianity we know today results from a selection process. Other voices were silenced. Part 165. Rome's Catacombs and Early Christian Communities. Under Rome extend hundreds of kilometers of underground galleries, the catacombs. From the 2nd century, Christians buried their dead there. Contrary to persistent legend, the catacombs did not serve as hiding places during persecutions. Roman authorities knew of their existence. They were cemeteries, not refuges. But the catacombs are archaeological treasures. Walls are covered with frescoes depicting biblical scenes: Jonah and the whale, Daniel in the lion's den, the Good Shepherd. These images reveal early Christians' theology: hope of resurrection, divine protection, Christ as guide. Rome's catacombs plunge us into early Christian centuries' piety. Faith expressed itself in stone and paint. Chapter 4. New Testament Manuscripts. How has the New Testament come to us? Through thousands of manuscripts, copied by hand, for centuries. Part 166. Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest complete manuscripts. Codex Vaticanus, preserved at the Vatican Library, is one of the oldest complete Bible manuscripts. It dates to mid-4th century, around 350 CE. This codex contains almost all the Old Testament in Greek, Septuagint, and the New Testament. Only a few passages are missing, including the end of Hebrews and Revelation. The text is written in uncials, Greek capital letters, without spaces between words, no punctuation. A difficult read for modern eyes. Codex Vaticanus is a textual source of primary importance. Modern Bible translations rely heavily on it. This manuscript reminds us that every New Testament word was copied, by hand, by devoted scribes. Part 167. Codex Sinaiticus and its adventurous discovery. In 1844, a German biblical scholar named Constantine von Tischendorf visited St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. In a basket of papers destined for fire, he discovered sheets of ancient parchment. These sheets belonged to a 4th century biblical manuscript, Codex Sinaiticus. Tischendorf succeeded, after several visits, in acquiring the manuscript for Russia's Tsar. Codex Sinaiticus contains the Old Testament, incomplete, and complete New Testament, plus 2 ancient non-canonical Christian texts, Barnabas's Epistle and the Shepherd of Hermas. This manuscript is now shared among 4 institutions: British Library, St. Catherine's Monastery, Leipzig University, and Russia's National Library. Codex Sinaiticus reminds us that great treasures can be narrowly saved from destruction. Part 168. The Chester Beatty Papyri from the 3rd century. In the 1930s, an American collector named Chester Beatty acquired a series of biblical papyri discovered in Egypt. These papyri, dating to the 3rd century, contain important portions of Gospels, Acts, Paul's epistles, Revelation. They are among the oldest New Testament manuscripts. One of these papyri, P46, contains Paul's epistles and is dated around 200 CE, only 150 years after Paul wrote them. These ancient manuscripts allow specialists to reconstruct the New Testament's original text with remarkable precision. Chester Beatty papyri remind us that textual transmission was rapid and relatively faithful. Part 169. Fragment P52, the oldest New Testament manuscript. P52, also called the Rylands fragment, is the oldest known New Testament manuscript. It dates to about 125 CE. This tiny papyrus fragment, credit card-sized, contains a few verses from John's Gospel, chapter 18. It was discovered in Egypt and acquired by the John Rylands Library in Manchester. Its early dating is crucial. It proves John's Gospel was already circulating in Egypt in early 2nd century, only a few decades after its composition. p. 52 reminds us the Gospels were quickly spread and copied across the Mediterranean world. Part 170. Textual Variants and Textual Criticism. There exist about 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts, not counting ancient translations. None of these manuscripts is identical to the others. There exist thousands of textual variants, differences between manuscripts. Most are minimal: spelling, word order, synonyms. Some variants are more important. For example, Mark's Gospel ending, 16:9-20, is absent from the oldest manuscripts. It was probably added later. Textual criticism is the discipline that compares manuscripts to reconstruct the original text. It is meticulous, scientific work. Textual variants remind us the New Testament has a history. The text we read today is the fruit of a complex transmission process. Chapter 5: Archaeology and Modern Controversies. Biblical archaeology arouses passions, debates, controversies between faith and science. Part 171. The Shroud of Turin, Science versus Devotion. The Shroud of Turin, preserved in Turin Cathedral in Italy, is a linen cloth bearing the image of a man who appears to have been crucified. Many believe it is Jesus' shroud. Others think it is a medieval fake. In 1988, carbon-14 dating by 3 independent laboratories dated the fabric between 1260 and 1390, the medieval period. But some contest this dating, arguing the tested sample was contaminated or did not represent the original fabric. The Shroud of Turin illustrates the tension between scientific approach and religious belief. Some mysteries resist science. Part 172. The James Ossuary, Authentic or Fake? In 2002, an Israeli collector presented an ossuary, a bone box, bearing the inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. If authentic, this ossuary would be the first direct archaeological evidence of Jesus. An extraordinary discovery. But experts quickly contested authenticity. Israel Antiquities Authority accused the collector of forgery. A trial ensued, lasting 7 years. In 2012, the court acquitted the collector for lack of sufficient evidence of falsification. But this does not prove the inscription's authenticity. The James ossuary remains controversial. It illustrates the difficulty of distinguishing true from false when stakes are enormous. Part 173. The Talpiot Tomb, Jesus' Tomb. In 1980, during construction work in Talpiot, a Jerusalem neighborhood, a tomb containing 10 ossuaries was discovered. Some ossuaries bore inscriptions, Jesus son of Joseph, Mary, Matthew, Jose, Judas son of Jesus. In 2007, a documentary suggested this could be Jesus of Nazareth's family tomb. Jesus would thus have been buried, not resurrected. The vast majority of archaeologists and biblical scholars rejected this hypothesis. The names were very common. Thousands of Jews were named Jesus, Joseph, Mary. The Talpiot tomb shows how archaeological discoveries can be instrumentalized for sensationalist theses. Part 174. Simcha Jakubowicz in Spectacle Archaeology. Simcha Jakubowicz, a Canadian-Israeli documentary filmmaker, has produced several films claiming to have discovered the Ark of the Covenant, Jesus' tomb, crucifixion nails. His documentaries, broadcast on mainstream channels, attract millions of viewers. But the scientific community criticizes them severely. Jakubowicz is accused of presenting speculation as facts, ignoring expert opinions, creating sensationalism. These documentaries illustrate a problem. Biblical archaeology popularization can drift toward spectacle archaeology, sacrificing scientific rigor for audience. Jakubowicz reminds us we must always verify sources and consult experts before accepting an extraordinary discovery. Part 175. Contested Biblical Sites, Political Controversies. In Israel and Palestine, archaeology is often politicized. Identifying a site as biblical can have political, nationalist, religious implications. Some groups use archaeology to legitimize territorial claims. Others accuse Israeli archaeologists of instrumentalizing the Bible. For example, excavations under Jerusalem's Temple Mount are denounced by some Palestinians as attempts to Judaize the city. These controversies show archaeology is never neutral. It always exists within political and ideological contexts. Contested sites remind us biblical archaeology is not practiced in an ivory tower. It is at the heart of living conflicts. Chapter 6. Revolutionary Scientific Methods. Modern archaeology has tools our predecessors could never have imagined. DNA, isotopes, artificial intelligence. Part 176. DNA analysis of ancient bones. Ancient DNA now allows studying past populations, their migrations, kinships, diseases. In 2020, researchers analyzed DNA from bones discovered in Bab eth-Dra tombs, a site possibly linked to Sodom. Analysis revealed these populations had varied genetic origins, testifying to migrations and population mixing. DNA also allows identifying family relationships. In some tombs, researchers confirmed buried individuals were truly related. DNA analysis opens new perspectives for understanding who biblical populations really were. Part 177. Isotopic Analysis and Ancient Migrations. Stable isotopes, atom variations in bones and teeth, record information about an individual's diet and place of life. By analyzing oxygen and strontium isotopes, researchers can determine where a person grew up, if they migrated. These analyses have been applied to bones from Jericho, Megiddo, Jerusalem, revealing population movements no text mentions. For example, some individuals buried in Jerusalem had grown up elsewhere, probably in Egypt or Mesopotamia, testifying to ancient mobility. Isotopic analysis gives us access to individual stories invisible in grand narratives. Part 178. Mass Spectrometry and Organic Residue Analysis. Mass spectrometry can identify minute traces of organic substances, oils, wines, perfumes, incense. In 2020, researchers analyzed residues in jars discovered at Bethany. They found traces of nard, a precious perfume mentioned in John's Gospel. John recounts that Mary of Bethany anointed Jesus' feet with pure nard perfume. This detail, once anecdotal, takes concrete dimension. These analyses show biblical texts often describe precise material realities. Mass spectrometry brings us closer to gestures, smells, sensations of the biblical world. Part 179. Photogrammetry and 3D Site Reconstruction. Photogrammetry allows creating precise 3D models of archaeological sites from photographs. These models can be studied virtually, shared online, used for reconstructions. The Capernaum site, for example, has been entirely modeled in 3D. One can now visit it virtually, see the synagogue, Peter's house, from all angles. These technologies democratize access to archaeology. No need to travel to see sites. Photogrammetry reminds us technology can make the past accessible to everyone. Part 180. Artificial Intelligence and Reading Carbonized Texts. In 2023, an international team used AI to read a carbonized Herculaneum scroll without unrolling it. AI, trained on thousands of papyrus images, learned to detect ink traces invisible to the naked eye. This technology could revolutionize ancient manuscript study. Texts considered illegible could be deciphered. Imagine applying this technology to Dead Sea Scrolls, to burned Qumran papyri. Lost texts could resurface. AI opens doors toward textual treasures still hidden. Chapter 7. Neighboring Empires and Their Influence. Israel did not exist in a vacuum. All around, powerful empires. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Part 181. Shalmaneser III's Black Obelisk and King Jehu. Shalmaneser III's Black Obelisk, preserved at the British Museum, is an Assyrian monument dating to the 9th century BCE. It depicts vassal kings paying homage to the Assyrian king. One of these kings is identified by inscription, Jehu, son of Omri. Jehu was king of Israel around 841 to 814 BCE. The Bible recounts his bloody coup and his zeal for Yahweh. The obelisk shows Jehu prostrate before Shalmaneser, bringing tribute. A humiliating scene the Bible does not mention. The Black Obelisk reminds us Israel was a small vassalized kingdom, crushed by empires. Part 182. The Mesha Stele and the Kingdom of Moab. The Mesha Stele, discovered in 1868 in Jordan, is a monument of Moabite King Mesha dating to the 9th century BCE. The inscription in Moabite language, very close to Hebrew, celebrates Mesha's victories against Israel. It mentions Omri, king of Israel, and describes how Mesha freed himself from Israelite yoke. The Bible, in 2 Kings 3, recounts the same war but from the Israelite viewpoint. The two accounts diverge on the outcome. The Mesha stele is the longest text in Canaanite language ever discovered. It has immense linguistic value. This stele reminds us each people wrote its own version of history. Sources must be cross-referenced. Part 183. The Amarna Letters and Canaanite Diplomacy. The Amarna Letters are a diplomatic correspondence archive discovered in Egypt, dating to the 14th century BCE. These letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform, were exchanged between Pharaoh and kings of Canaan, Syria, Mesopotamia. They reveal a world of small vassal kingdoms, constantly in conflict, soliciting Egyptian aid, denouncing each other. Some letters mention the Habru, a group of marginalized people possibly linked to Hebrews, though this link is debated. The Amarna letters plunge us into the Levant's complex geopolitics before Israel's emergence. Part 184. The Cyrus Cylinder and Jewish Liberation. The Cyrus Cylinder, preserved at the British Museum, is a Babylonian document dating to 539 BCE. It proclaims Cyrus's policy, Persian king, restore local cults, repatriate deported peoples, rebuild temples. This policy allowed Jews exiled in Babylon to return to Judea and rebuild Jerusalem's temple. The Book of Ezra presents Cyrus as God's instrument. The cylinder confirms Cyrus indeed had a tolerant policy. The Cyrus Cylinder reminds us Jewish history was deeply influenced by empire policies. Part 185. Persian Archives and Judah's Administration. Under Persian domination, 539 to 332 BCE, Judah became the province of Yehud. Administrative seals bearing the inscription Yehud have been discovered. These seals testify to organized local administration. Persians allowed provinces some autonomy, as long as they paid tribute. Aramaic documents from this period, discovered at Elephantine in Egypt, reveal exchanges between the local Jewish community and Jerusalem authorities. Persian administration was efficient and relatively benevolent. It allowed Judaism to rebuild after exile. Persian archives show us the post-exilic period was crucial for Judaism's formation as we know it. Chapter 8. Archaeology and Environment. Archaeology is not limited to objects and buildings. It also studies climates, landscapes, ancient ecosystems. Part 186. Dead Sea Sediment Cores. Sediment cores taken from the Dead Sea bottom allow reconstructing the last millennia's climate. Sediment layers record water level variations, drought periods, floods. Analyses show that in the 9th century BCE, a major drought struck the region. This period corresponds to biblical accounts of famines under kings Ahab and Elijah. Environment profoundly influenced political and social life. A drought could trigger famines, migrations, wars. Sediment cores remind us human history unfolds in a natural framework that shapes it. Part 187. Pollen Analysis and Biblical Landscapes. Pollen analysis studies fossilized pollens in sediments. Each plant produces characteristic pollen. By analyzing pollens, one can reconstruct ancient vegetation, olive trees, vines, cereals, forests. These analyses reveal ancient Palestine's landscape was more wooded than today. Progressive deforestation, linked to agriculture and urbanization, modified the environment. Some biblical passages describing dense forests correspond to pollen results. The text reflects environmental reality. Pollen analysis helps us visualize biblical landscapes as they truly were. Part 188. Studies on Erosion and Ancient Agriculture. Soil erosion is a natural process, but agriculture can accelerate it. Agricultural terraces, if poorly maintained, can collapse. Geomorphological studies show certain Judean areas experienced intense erosion episodes, probably linked to agricultural abandonment during political crises. These crises, invasions, deportations, wars, are mentioned in the Bible. Environmental archaeology finds their traces in the landscape. For example, after Jerusalem's destruction in 586 BCE, many villages were abandoned. Terraces ceased being maintained. Soil eroded. Erosion studies remind us political events have lasting environmental consequences. Part 189. Faunal Remains and Diet. Animal bones found at archaeological sites reveal what people ate. In ancient Israel, remains show consumption of sheep, goats, cattle, fish. Very little pork, conforming to biblical prohibitions. But in Philistine sites, pig bones are frequent. This dietary difference marks a cultural boundary. Analyses also reveal diet varied by period. In times of crisis, people ate more cereals and less meat. Faunal remains plunge us into biblical populations' daily dietary life. Part 190. Climate Change and Biblical Crises. Recent climate studies suggest environmental changes contributed to antiquity's political crises. For example, the Late Bronze Age end, around 1200 BCE, coincides with a prolonged drought period. This environmental crisis would have weakened great empires, favoring new peoples' emergence, including Israel. Similarly, certain biblical decline periods correspond to unfavorable climate phases. Climate does not explain everything, but it creates favorable or unfavorable conditions. It influences history. Climate changes remind us human history unfolds in natural cycles that exceed it. Chapter 9. Archaeology and Theology. What relationship between archaeology and faith? Can archaeology prove or refute the Bible? Or is their dialogue more subtle? Part 191. When archaeology confirms a biblical detail. Sometimes archaeology confirms a biblical detail that seemed insignificant. For example, a governor named Pilate's existence. In 1961, a stone bearing a Latin inscription was discovered at Caesarea Maritima. It mentions Pontius Pilatus, Praefectus Iudii. This stone confirms Pilate was indeed governor of Judea, as the Gospels say. A secondary detail, but important. Such confirmations do not prove everything in the Bible is true, but they show biblical authors described a real world. Archaeology does not prove faith, but it can confirm the historical framework in which faith developed. Part 192. When archaeology contradicts biblical narrative. Sometimes archaeology contradicts biblical narrative. For example, absence of massive destruction traces at Jericho at Joshua's supposed time. These contradictions do not necessarily mean the Bible lies. Perhaps the account is symbolic, theological, or our chronology is wrong. Archaeology requires nuancing our readings. It invites distinguishing between historical core and narrative embellishment. This nuanced approach is sometimes uncomfortable, but it is honest. Archaeology reminds us the Bible is a complex work, not a history manual. Part 193. The Bible as theology, not as reporting. Modern biblical scholars emphasize the Bible is not journalistic reporting. It is theological meditation on history. A biblical narrative can be historically based while being theologically oriented. Authors select, interpret, stylize. For example, the Exodus, perhaps a group of Semites fled Egypt. But the biblical narrative transforms this event into a founding epic. Recognizing this takes nothing from the Bible's value. On the contrary, it enriches our reading. The Bible as theology invites us to seek not the letter but the Spirit. Part 194. Necessary dialogue between faith and archaeology. Faith and archaeology do not necessarily oppose. They can dialogue fruitfully. Archaeology enriches faith by revealing historical context. It makes biblical narratives more concrete, more alive. Faith, for its part, poses deep questions to archaeology: what meaning to give discoveries? How to interpret history? This dialogue requires mutual respect. Archaeologists must not despise faith. Believers must not ignore science. Faith archaeology dialogue is an invitation to humility and openness. Part 195. Archaeology as invitation to theological finesse. Archaeology invites believers to a finer reading of the Bible. Understanding the Bible is the product of a long redactional process, that texts were written at different times, in different contexts, enriches reading. This does not weaken faith. It makes it more mature, more nuanced, more profound. Divine revelation was incarnated in human history, with all its complexity. Archaeology helps us understand this incarnation. Archaeology reminds us God speaks through the human, the contingent, the temporal. Chapter 10, Epilogue. The journey continues. We have reached the end of this long journey. 200 facts. 200 windows opened onto the biblical world. But this is not an end. Part 196. Each year brings new discoveries. Biblical archaeology is not a frozen field. Each year, new discoveries are announced. New sites are excavated. Manuscripts are deciphered. Unprecedented technologies reveal hidden information. This constant renewal guarantees our understanding of the biblical world will continue evolving. What seems certain today may be nuanced tomorrow. Archaeology is an endless quest. Future discoveries remind us history is never definitively written. Part 197. Questions that remain open. Despite all our progress, so many questions remain open. Did the Exodus occur? Where is the Ark of the Covenant? What was Jesus' true face? These questions may never find definitive answer. And perhaps that is better. Mystery has value. It maintains wonder, quest, research. Faith demanding absolute proofs would cease being faith. Knowledge claiming to explain everything would be arrogant. Open questions remind us of intellectual humility's importance. Part 198. Archaeology and Collective Imagination. Biblical archaeology feeds collective imagination. Films, novels, documentaries draw inspiration from it. This cultural impact is positive. It keeps interest in ancient history alive. But it carries a risk, confusion between fiction and reality. Indiana Jones is not an archaeologist. Real archaeology is less spectacular but more fascinating. It demands patience, rigor, humility. Archaeology and imagination remind us truth is often stranger than fiction. Part 199. Why does biblical archaeology fascinate so much? Why does biblical archaeology arouse such passion? Because it touches our spiritual origins. For billions of people, the Bible is a sacred text. Discovering material traces of the biblical world creates tangible connection with faith. But even for non-believers, biblical archaeology fascinates. It explores Western civilization's roots, its values, its myths. Biblical archaeology is a bridge between past and present, between faith and reason, between myth and history. It fascinates because it poses fundamental questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Part 200. Mystery remains, and that is good. At this journey's end, one truth emerges: mystery remains. We have explored 200 facts, visited dozens of sites, examined thousands of objects. But so much remains obscure. This mystery is not failure. It is an invitation to continue. To seek. To question. To wonder. Archaeology does not destroy the sacred. It teaches us to inhabit it differently. With more knowledge. With more respect for complexity. And perhaps, at bottom, that is true wisdom, accepting some questions will remain unanswered. Living with mystery. And finding in this mystery itself a source of beauty, meaning, hope. Good night, dear listeners. May your dreams carry you to ancient lands, to forgotten truths and preserved mysteries.